Dr. Anne Bissonnette has served as an associate professor in material culture and curatorship and as curator of the Anne Lambert Clothing and Textile Collection at the University of Alberta since 2009. Prior to this position, she served as curator of the Kent State University Museum in Ohio for 14 years. Her curatorial research for her doctoral work led to a series of 3 exhibitions on late 18th and early 19th century fashion that led to her first Richard Martin Award. An exhibition on eyewear co-curated with undergraduate students in one of her dress history courses has led to a second Martin Award. A third exhibition on Inuit dolls co-curated with an undergraduate student intern received a commendation from the Martin Award Committee. She is a generalist but currently focused on 1790s dress behavior. And today she will be speaking with us about her latest research, which she has entitled Studying Fashion, War, and Politics in 1790s France, a Material Culture Perspective. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you to everyone at the Bard Graduate Center for this wonderful invitation, and welcome. My name is Anne Bissonnette, and I will be discussing research in fashion studies that pertains to dress in 1790s France. Many components of this research have been going on for years, but the research has blossomed considerably when I received an $81,000 grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research of Canada. This work is in its final last or one can get a 1-year extension, which I'm likely to get, or last year or so. But it is also a citizen science web portal that is being done right now that may lead others, you or other people you know, to join our research in the near future. With this work, I hope to shed light on a pivotal period in fashion history when modernity in dress was particularly grounded in politics. The project is called A Revolutionary Decade, Fashion and Material Culture in the 1790s. It begins in revolutionary France and expands to places traditionally affected by French style, England, Germany, the US, and Canada. It aims to map 1790s fashions and explore their aesthetics and cultural significance. The research started with my PhD in Museum Studies and History that culminated in a 2003 exhibition and catalog entitled Fashion on the Ohio Frontier, 1790 to 1840. During my doctoral research, I observed a discrepancy between 1790s artifacts and the literature on dress in this period. Overall, 1790s artifacts were few compared with those in the decades before or after in the collection I visited. Linking different types of sources together was key as many dress artifacts had no provenance. Some fine fashionable specimens could not be explained in the quote-unquote rough farmers Western frontier mythology. I was told settlers lived rough lives, dressed in homespun clothes, and few early pieces had survived. I aimed to verify this. Artifacts and texts, such as the journal entry by James Flint, pointed to something different, describing a part of Ohio that was sparsely settled by Euro-Americans at this time. Flint wrote among this text here that indeed I have often seen among the inhabitants of the log houses of America females with dresses composed of the muslins of Britain, the silks of India, and the crepes of China. End of quote. Although limitations exist in the use of dress artifacts in historical research, the pieces found indicated that the meaning of fashion in the late 18th and early 19th century did not change with the movement of a population west. What I labeled frontier reductionism had been at play. The search for artifacts helped to reveal a diversity of settling experiences, mostly those of women, nearly absent in Ohio's bicentennial celebrations, for which this exhibition was created in 2003. Still, at the end of my degree, I could not fully grasp the 1790s when another form of reductionism takes place. Most works move quietly from the conventional 18th century woman's silhouette to the neoclassical one. In other words, from conical stays compressing and lumping the breasts, creating a narrow waist and worn with voluminous underskirts that obscured the lower limbs, to a new archetype delineating individual breasts with below the bust cinching and worn with underskirts that could allow greater lower body delineation. My research aims to understand how the silhouette transition took place and why, in some ways similar to the transition that is happening during World War I. In 2006, the Paris American Academy gave me a grant to spend a month at the Galliera Museum in Paris, which allowed me the opportunity to visit other collections. This was another turning point in my own ability to bridge the divide between 1790s objects, visual renderings, mostly fashion plates, and editorial texts in periodicals. To coincide with the second venue of Fashion on the Ohio Frontier in 2006, I curated 2 new exhibitions based on my doctoral research to create a tourism loop. The Age of Nudity explored changes in underpinnings and the different ways clothes were worn in the late 18th century. A focus on embodiment allowed me to observe how the body can be delineated through clothes, which, as you can tell, was a major thing later in the century. But when faced with such paintings, one wonders, was it real or artistic license? The ability to photograph fashion plates in the Journal des Dames et des Modes at the Galliera allowed me to look not only at a few plates individually, but also observe them collectively. What that research demonstrated is a great diversity in silhouettes and style, and much emphasis on accessories and hair, which are quite important in captions. Questions arose, such as, if one plate shows a sleeveless dress, did that make that style a typical one? I looked at the data qualitatively and quantitatively, not because I love math, far from, but because my privileged access to the data led me to this approach. I could then assess what was typical and what was atypical, which I believe is missing from current scholarship and helps to explain garments in collections. In 1798 Paris, for instance, exposed arms are rising in popularity, but are not evenly adopted. I am fortunate to have the opportunity to photograph the editorial text that accompanied the plates at the Design Museum Denmark in Copenhagen. This allowed me to understand, for instance, that the generous exposure of bosoms was indeed a documented dress practice at a specific time and place. Without data, this behavior may have been depicted by artists or illustrators as a way to situate their work in a neoclassical context or to wind up interest. The hair exhibition in 2006 allowed me to look at another understudied type of dress behavior in historical context. I was particularly interested in the incroyables and merveilleuses, who excelled in excesses. Between the theatrical production of stage plays like Brutus in 1791 on your left, and what could be a caricature of young dandies on your right, we must seek to understand what are typical behaviors in order to address extreme ones. This is where the quantitative approach is helpful, and where my team and I will spend the coming months. The gal on your left, for example, is the first woman with short hair in the Journal des Dames et des Modes, and is also shown bareheaded in public, 2 atypical dress behaviors. Still, this visual has been used many times to represent the period. While found in a primary source, representing short hair as typical is incorrect based on a study of the journal. Through this research, we can reassess the capillary behavior in similarly stunning visuals that were thought to have occurred during the Reign of Terror. Other features found in fashion plates also merit to be scrutinized, such as the use of color and certain gestures, which are part of our study. When first exposed to the Galliera collection, I found the presence of subcaptions in the journal very interesting, and wrote about this short-lived behavior in the June 2015 issue of Journal for 18th Century Studies. 52 of the plates either used dessinées d'après nature, or drawn from life, or placements on the page that indicated real individuals, activities, places, and or times. The rest omit these words, but follow the same font size and placement that corresponds to a reporting of events in line with documentary journalism. Through a phenomenon that lasted less than a year, I explored the strengths and limitations of fashion plates in the journal and other types of primary illustrative sources for the 2015 article. I found many of the plates useful to reassess caricatures distinguish attire worn in public compared with studio portraits, explain how one plate, with or without subcaption, cannot lead to a generalization, and how embodiment issues can be expressed visually. Some of the 1790s plates led me into another rabbit hole of research about the influence of specific ancient works of art on fashion, as in the case of the Venus Callipygos. This led to a graduate student exhibition and a co-authored 2015 article in Dress. Important milestones in my research have occurred when, confronted with real garments, I have to make sense of them. This is a case for a gown found in the Greensboro Historical Museum that was worn by American First Lady Dolly Payne Todd Madison. The fragile piece had been altered, and at that not very skillfully, and the lining showed signs of reuse. Alterations are common in the 18th century, but this is particularly frequent for 1790s pieces, as the waistline rose first in a visual manner through the use of wide sashes, and around 1794, bodices and skirt could be assembled above the natural waistline. Using the lining, I tried to reverse engineer the gown to understand the wearer's life. Dolly went on to live an illustrious life so that we know more about her compared to women of her generation. Her father was first prosperous enough to send her older brother to Europe to receive a gentleman's education, but his wealth declined when Dolly was a young woman. In addition to her Quaker upbringing, this likely had an impact on the way she dressed, as it was a sign of status in the Philadelphia of her youth. How would a young Philadelphia Quaker from a good family dress when first married between 1790 and 1793, as a widow, and early in her second marriage 11 months later? This pushed me to examine American, English, and French styles. However, between 1792 and 1796, French plates were no longer produced due to revolutionary turmoil, which complicates matters in the whole research project. We see many long fitted sleeves and waistlines with sashes. I use my European research to find transitional styles that could have similar features. A center front lining with lacing was found, but the back panel was much wider. Most pieces I used for comparison had no provenance, so I must still familiarize myself with cut-and construction while also using visual depictions of fashions and the wearer to understand dress behavior of the period. Through this, it would appear that Dolly, despite being a Quaker, had a definite interest in high fashion, as can be compared with the picture of Dolly, or the rendition of Dolly, and some of the dress behavior, mostly accessories and proportion of the gown. A gown that is said to have belonged to Dolly was found in the collection of the National Society of Colonial Dames of America in Boston. Its bodice is of a length that is closer to the original lining of the Greensboro gown, but the back panel is wider. By examining a variety of artifacts, I can begin to understand 1790s style and their variations. The close study of artifacts also leads to a greater awareness of the lingering use of stays that compress the chest in a conical manner. This is often misunderstood when gathered front panels create a certain volume over the chest. This dress behavior lasts into the second half of the 1790s and can be accompanied with the wearing of voluminous petticoats. Dress of the 1795 and 1799 Directoire is typically described as high-waisted and narrow at the skirt. A broader definition is in order, as is a better understanding of the aesthetic, ideological, and moral changes that occurred at this time to track the shift to what was called a natural body, where breasts were defined individually and petticoat volume decreased. The close examination of Dolly's altered Greensboro gown and the triangulation of this piece with other garments and visual sources led to a series of hypotheses. Based on the cut, the earlier unaltered dress is likely from before 1794. It was either in service during her maidenhood as a young Quaker woman of the upper classes in the late 1780s, or it may have been worn during her first marriage to the prosperous John Todd Jr. between 1790 and 1793. In its modified form, it likely dates from no earlier than 1794 and no later than 1799. Was it modified during her widowhood before her September 1794 marriage to James Madison, when her inheritance was not yet settled with her in-laws and finances are a big concern? Or was it done during the 1797 to 99 retirement of the Madisons to Virginia? As high waistlines are documented in 1794 and fashion appears to have been of interest to Dolly, I would lean towards option number one. She made do with what she had. Much has been said about Dolly's love of luxury and dress and her extravagant ensemble. According to Catherine Alger, those drove James Madison into severe debt during the White House years. Investigating her life, we find numerous periods of financial insecurity. Our artifact's rather clumsy remake is not a perfect fit in her fashionable elitist persona. The close examination of a gown may make her more human in her struggle and journey as a young woman. Through the research, we can focus on what is likely a formative period in her life. The dress may be a testimony to one's ability to reuse and stay current with fashion despite difficulties. It may speak to her sense of self and inform excesses in times of plenty. The research also strengthened my desire to continue this type of material culture research. How to do this has led me back to my roots in fashion design, to follow in the footsteps of my mentor, Betty Kirk, and her work on Madeleine Vionnet. Kirk is my champion when it comes to addressing fashion's materiality. Dress design is a field where cloth meets craftsmanship to generate a myriad of ways to cover the body, and yet materiality is seldom thoroughly explored. Kirk's research reinserted the concrete to the abstract to convey a balanced perspective on her subject, permissible through experiential learning. By painstakingly measuring the weft of many artifacts cut on the bias at 2-inch increments, she exposed a system of making that is at the core of Madeleine Vionet's brilliance. By scrutinizing artifacts in museum and private collection for over 20 years and through a careful analysis of a vast quantity of data, Kirk found a key to understanding Vionnet that few other researchers have embraced before or since. In doing so, she secured a legacy for the creative ideas of Madeleine Vionnet and set a new path for unconventional scholarly research in the field of dress and dress history. She drew meaning from the making, and so I began to systematically measure garments to make patterns of them. The pieces gained in importance. The approach forces me to take my time and to really look. I feel myself drawn to the makers and the wearers' lives in a new way. I have traveled to different institutions that would let me measure their pieces. My team and I make patterns and search for visuals that help to categorize different types of gowns. With this approach, I am piecing the 1790s story together, one gown at a time. The mapping is well underway, and the ultimate goal is to apply a more theorized macro-level analysis that will observe the interaction of dress with the political, philosophical, artistic, and economic changes taking place in society. The 2017 grant is a major step in that direction. My PhD student, Patricia Seifert, and I conducted field research in England, France, and Germany in the summer of 2018, and I returned to France this past summer. As a person who is overworked on an everyday basis, I know a request for access means time and energy for staff, and I am utterly grateful when requests are granted. Direct access is an essential part of the research. We still found very few pieces with provenance, but were delighted nonetheless. What Mida and Kim have called the slow approach to seeing requires time to draw the pieces to access materials, proportion, construction details, and cut. When allowed, we added the intrusive step of measuring the piece. Despite great care, mistakes were made in 2018 that led to the omission of certain measurements, which impacted our ability to create patterns when we return home. Undeterred, yet greatly annoyed, this has led me to reassess the way garments are measured. we are currently fine-tuning our measuring protocol that we aim to publish and post. I believe that, especially when people can demonstrate their training in handling fragile artifacts, allowing the manipulation of clothing can be a calculated risk. Most of you will know that books with patterns of historical clothing are available. However, few authors, beside Betty Kirk, have shared their methodology. In the current environment, when are researchers given enough time to measure at 2-inch increments? As part of our measuring protocol, we are hoping to streamline the process. Photographing remains important, but it is now supplemental to the pattern making process. One easy thing we did is to add a checkered cloth to the process. You can see on your left the amount of skewing done in Adobe Photoshop to the original photograph. When we missed key measurements in 2018, we could have greatly benefited from the presence of a checkered cloth when we tried to use our photos to find the missing measurements by projecting our photos on the screen. The way to measure a piece, especially parts of the sleeves that cannot lay flat, is part of our challenge. What we decided to do is a method that involves two people, a measurer and a note taker. This is gentler on the artifact, and we hope it leads to a more systematic and precise approach. You can see on the screen, but eventually we'll also have this posted on our website. By presenting at this conference, and other conferences in the past, I have recruited volunteers who will start to test our protocol this fall. As such, the website will have a citizen science portion that explains how I can either go to an institution if I have funds to do so, or I can use our streamlined method and suggest to you how to do it yourself. In doing so, we hope to lessen the 20-year research span of the illustrious Betty Kirk and continue the research when the funding dwindles. Mind you, my funded travel allowed me to start a summer fashion history crash course in Paris to fund future research. Ask me about that if you're interested. As you can see, we can hope to share findings when possible, but this is currently a copyright nightmare. If we are given the permission to post patterns and or images, we plan to share this information via two databases, one for patterns and one for visuals. When work is published, we also will share this information on our web portal. As our government funding is from the public purse, we are also obliged to publish in open access journals, as is the case for my latest articles based partly on the research I did to assist Dr. Erica Dolphin at the National Gallery of Canada. The data we have produced thus far help to reassess the sitter's dress and contextualize this peau seigneuresse from Quebec's bourgeoisie. A gown from the University of Alberta's Anne Lambert Clothing and Textile Collection helped to address embodiment issues and demonstrate how the improperly called empire waistline may actually sit on the breast during the 1790s due to the lingering use of conical stays. This clothing-centric funding was also demonstrated during a Costume Society of America conference by Mackenzie Scholl of Fig Leaf Pattern. It's always interesting to go to conferences, and what you're finding is also something somebody else is demonstrating in other ways. My team and I are in the process of writing about typical menswear dress practices. We presented this at the latest Costume Society of America Symposium, and this will allow us to reassess the incroyables and their excesses. My PhD student, Patricia Seaford, is jumping into the 1790s bandwagon, and her research focus is on a French Revolutionary fan where monetary instruments called assignats were reproduced. She explores the type of politically charged artifact used by women in a society that fought for freedom, yet denied half of their population suffrage. In doing so, she aims to shed light on women's modes of expression during the Revolution. So please contact me if you have any more information on the research, if you want to be alerted when the website is functional, or if you want to measure 1790s artifact that you may have access to. With your help, we can bring light to a misunderstood decade, chart a path for collaborative research, and use artifacts in ways that can push boundaries of knowledge. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to chatting with you after the presentation. I also strongly urge you to join the Costume Society of America so others are informed of your own research. The next symposium is in New York, and the deadline for proposal is October 1st. And I think everyone in this room likely has a great interest or research that would benefit the rest of the scholars involved. Thank you.